History rarely announces itself when it turns. The moment of change usually passes quietly, unnoticed by those living inside it. By the time the shift becomes obvious, it has already reshaped the ground beneath everyone's feet. Across centuries, the same pattern appears again and again. Large systems expand, stabilize, and slowly lose the conditions that made them work. Confidence remains long after foundations begin to thin. Institutions continue to perform their rituals. Markets keep pricing tomorrow as if yesterday still applies. Life feels normal precisely because the system is still functioning, even as it begins to function differently. This is how transitions hide. They do not arrive as sudden events, but as extended phases. Each phase feels temporary, manageable, and reversible. Adjustments are framed as corrections. Strains are explained away as noise. People adapt without realizing they are adapting to something new. Over time, the system becomes dependent on those adaptations, and return to the old balance quietly stops being possible. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The rhythm is recognizable. Growth followed by strain. Strain followed by normalization. Normalization followed by fragility. What collapses first is rarely material. It is belief. Trust that institutions will respond. Trust that incentives still align. Trust that the structures people rely on are as solid as they appear. The most dangerous phase is not collapse, but continuity. When systems show stress yet continue operating, they create the illusion of control. Rules still exist. Titles still carry authority. Numbers still move in expected ranges. The surface suggests stability, while beneath it, the logic holding everything together slowly changes shape. Collective behavior plays a critical role here. Individuals respond rationally to what they can see. They optimize within the system they know. Careers, reputations, and identities become tied to the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. Questioning the system feels abstract, even irresponsible, compared to managing immediate demands. And so, participation becomes reinforcement. What history shows is not sudden ruin, but delayed recognition. The moment people agree that something fundamental has changed usually comes after change has already happened. By then, the system no longer needs belief to continue unraveling. Momentum replaces intention. Processes run on inertia. Decisions narrow as options quietly disappear. This documentary is about that space between stability and breakdown. The interval where nothing appears wrong enough to stop the machine, yet everything important is already shifting. It is about how societies misread continuity as safety and how calm surfaces conceal irreversible transitions. Not because people are foolish, but because systems are designed to look strongest just before they stop being resilient. It unfolds through committees, reports, revisions, and measured language. Through optimism that problems can be deferred, and faith that scale itself provides protection. The transition phase rewards patience and punishes alarm, training societies to tolerate gradual loss of coherence. By the time coherence matters again, it exists only in memory, referenced in hindsight as something once assumed, never defended, and rarely noticed while it was quietly fading. That quiet fading is a sound history makes when it moves forward without asking permission from those still convinced nothing changed. When historians look back at large empires, they rarely point to a single moment of failure. Rome did not fall in a day, nor did the Spanish Empire, the Ming Dynasty, or the long arc of British dominance. What they shared was a prolonged period where institutions continued to function while their underlying logic eroded. Taxes were still collected. Armies still marched. Laws were still enforced. Yet the system that once converted power into stability gradually stopped doing so. In many cases, expansion itself planted the seeds of strain. As systems grow, they become more complex, more layered, and more dependent on coordination. Decision-making slows. Feedback becomes distorted as information passes through hierarchies. Local problems are misread at the center, while central policies produce unintended effects at the edges. To manage this, institutions add procedures, roles, and safeguards. These additions preserve order, but they also increase fragility. Financial systems follow a similar rhythm. Credit expands to fuel growth. Confidence allows obligations to stretch across time. As long as trust holds, the system appears stronger the larger it becomes. But scale masks sensitivity. Small disruptions require ever larger interventions. What once corrected itself now needs management. Stability turns into maintenance, and maintenance quietly becomes dependence. Psychological blindness emerges during this phase. People inside the system experience continuity, not decline. Their daily routines remain intact. Promotions still happen. Paychecks still clear, because the system rewards participation. Those who benefit most have the least incentive to question its direction. Skepticism feels theoretical, while compliance feels practical. Historical records show repeated moments where warning voices existed but were marginalized, not silenced by force, but by procedure. Concerns were acknowledged, studied, and deferred. Committees formed. Reports circulated. Time passed. The system absorbed dissent without altering course. This gave the appearance of responsiveness, while preserving momentum. Eventually, the system's output stopped matching expectations. Military victories become costlier. Economic growth slows despite intervention. Administrative complexity outpaces effectiveness. At this point, explanations multiply. External factors are blamed. Temporary cycles are cited. The possibility that the structure itself has changed becomes uncomfortable to consider. What makes these periods difficult to recognize is that decline does not feel like collapse. It feels like adjustment. Each generation inherits a slightly weaker version of the system and treats it as normal. Memory shortens. What once seemed extraordinary becomes assumed, then forgotten. Stability is redefined downward without ceremony. If these patterns feel familiar, it may be worth staying with this channel. This is a kind of slow repetition history leaves behind, and it is what we examine here. By the time historians later describe these eras, they compress decades into paragraphs. But for those living through them, the experience was one of gradual narrowing. Choices felt constrained but manageable. The system did not disappear. It transformed, leaving behind institutions that looked intact while no longer producing the outcomes they were built to deliver. The mechanics of decline operate quietly, through incentives rather than shocks. Systems are built to preserve themselves, and that instinct shapes how they respond under strain. When pressure rises, institutions rarely reverse course. They protect prior decisions, existing hierarchies, and the narratives that justified them. Change becomes incremental, framed as optimization rather than correction. Trust is the central currency in this phase. It allows complex systems to function without constant verification. People accept numbers, procedures, and authority because they assume others have already checked them. As trust thins, systems compensate by adding rules, documentation, and oversight. Ironically, these additions increase friction while signaling responsibility, creating the appearance of control as efficiency declines. Institutional inertia deepens a problem. Large organizations are rewarded for consistency, not adaptation. Careers are built on mastering existing frameworks. Deviating from them introduces risk without immediate reward. Even when evidence accumulates that assumptions no longer hold, altering course threatens reputations and stability. It becomes safer to manage the consequences than to challenge the structure producing them. Delayed reactions follow naturally. By the time a problem is acknowledged, it has already passed through several layers of normalization. Early signals were interpreted as anomalies. Mid-stage distortions were treated as temporary. Only when outcomes diverge significantly from expectations does response accelerate, and by then, available options are narrower. Individuals inside these systems experience this as professionalism. They focus on their role, their metrics, their scope. Responsibility is distributed so widely that no single actor feels accountable for direction. Each decision makes sense locally, even as the aggregate effect moves the system further from balance. This diffusion of responsibility creates moral comfort alongside structural drift. History shows that breakdowns are rarely caused by ignorance. They emerge from alignment. Everyone follows incentives correctly. Rules are obeyed. Processes are respected. The system fails not because people abandon it, but because they believe in it long after its conditions have changed. Communication also shifts. Language becomes cautious, technical, and abstract. Problems are described without emotional weight. This removes urgency while maintaining credibility. The absence of alarm is interpreted as reassurance. Calm messaging stabilizes behavior, even when stability is no longer supported by fundamentals. What disappears first is the ability to imagine alternatives. Once a system dominates education, expertise, and governance, thinking outside it feels unrealistic. Possibility narrows. Adaptation becomes internal rather than structural. The system bends inward, conserving form while losing function. This phase can last longer than expected. As long as outputs continue, even at reduced quality, participation continues. The system trains its members to confuse persistence with health. Only later does it become clear that what endured was not strength, but habit, reinforced by trust, inertia, and the slow acceptance of limits that were once unthinkable. During this interval, feedback loops invert. Actions meant to stabilize, amplify, and balance. Success metrics lag reality, rewarding continuation over correction. Time itself becomes a shield, because the longer a system survives strain, the more survivable it appears. This illusion delays recognition, allowing structural weakness to harden into permanence before anyone names it. By then, adaptation has already replaced choice, and the transition feels irreversible to observers. In modern systems, the same pattern expresses itself through scale and abstraction. Markets operate at speeds that exceed human intuition. Governments manage layers of policy too complex for direct accountability. Corporations grow large enough that decision-makers rarely see the consequences of their choices. Everything continues to function, yet fewer people can clearly explain why it works, only that it must. Normalization plays a central role. Conditions that once would cause concern are gradually accepted as background noise. Temporary measures become standard practice. Emergency tools remain in place long after the emergency has passed. Because change arrives incrementally, each step feels tolerable. The system does not demand belief in perfection, only acceptance of the current state as unavoidable. Data reinforces this process. Numbers provide comfort through precision, even when they describe instability. Models are adjusted to account for anomalies, which then cease to be anomalies. When outcomes diverge from expectations, the models evolve rather than the assumptions behind them. This preserves confidence while distancing understanding. In large organizations, responsibility continues to diffuse. A policy is shaped by committees, refined by analysts, approved by executives, and implemented by departments far removed from its origin. When results disappoint, causality becomes difficult to trace. Accountability dissolves into process. What remains is compliance, not clarity. Cultural narratives adapt as well. Language shifts to emphasize resilience, flexibility, and management. These concepts sound constructive, but they also imply acceptance of strain as permanent. Stress is framed as a feature to be navigated rather than a signal to reconsider direction. Over time, endurance replaces evaluation. Public discourse mirrors this adjustment. Conversations focus on short-term fluctuations rather than long-term trajectories. Attention moves quickly from one issue to the next, preventing accumulation of understanding. Complexity becomes a reason for deference rather than inquiry. When systems are described as too intricate to question, participation defaults to trust. What is striking is how calm these periods feel. Daily life continues. Innovation persists in pockets. Progress appears uneven but ongoing. This surface stability masks a deeper rigidity. Systems grow less capable of absorbing surprise, even as they present confidence. Flexibility becomes performative, while underlying dependencies tighten. History suggests that this phase is not marked by panic, but by professionalism. Experts remain measured. Institutions issue carefully worded statements. Adjustments are framed as proactive. The absence of visible distress reinforces the belief that nothing fundamental is at risk. Yet beneath this calm, options quietly contract. Reversibility fades. Actions that once could be undone become locked in through scale and interdependence. The system becomes impressive in appearance and fragile in essence, held together by routines that no longer produce renewal. The tension rises not through drama, but through accumulation. Each small compromise adds weight. Each postponed correction narrows the path forward. Because no single moment feels decisive, recognition is delayed. And when awareness finally sharpens, it arrives not as revelation, but as a sense that something essential has already slipped out of reach, leaving behind structures that continue to operate without restoring what made them viable in the first place. When the record of these cycles is read as a whole, a quiet truth emerges. What changes history is not the moment systems break, but the long period when they continue despite no longer working as intended. That is where meaning shifts, not in dramatic endings, but in the unnoticed redefinition of what is considered normal. Every era believes its structures are uniquely complex, too advanced to follow old patterns, and yet the same phases appear. Expansion builds confidence. Confidence delays doubt. Doubt is absorbed by procedure. Procedure replaces judgment. Over time, systems become excellent at preserving form while losing adaptability. They survive, but they no longer renew themselves. This is why transitions feel confusing rather than catastrophic. People sense tension without clarity. They feel pressure without a clear source. Life goes on, but with an undertone of strain that never fully resolves. History shows that this feeling is not a prelude to drama, but a signal of movement already underway. What is most unsettling is how rarely anyone feels responsible. The system appears to act on its own. Decisions feel inherited rather than chosen. Each participant plays a role that makes sense in isolation. Together, they produce outcomes no one explicitly intended. This is how inevitability forms, not through force, but through alignment. Looking backward, it is tempting to ask why people did not act sooner, but history suggests that awareness alone rarely changes direction. Systems do not turn when they are criticized. They turn when their internal logic can no longer sustain itself. Until then, they adapt just enough to persist. This perspective reframes collapse as a process rather than an event. It also reframes stability as conditional rather than permanent. What endures is not strength, but repetition. Structures echo earlier forms. Behaviors mirror past responses. The rhyme continues, even as the language changes. The purpose of examining these patterns is not to forecast outcomes or offer reassurance. It is to recognize the shape of transition while it is still quiet, to understand that calm does not equal balance, and continuity does not guarantee coherence. History leaves these clues not as warnings, but as records. If this way of looking at systems resonates, subscribing to the channel is one way to keep exploring these long patterns together. This space is dedicated to tracing how structures evolve, strain, and transform over time without noise or urgency. In the end, history does not rush. It moves patiently, allowing people to believe things will return to how they were, long after that possibility has passed. The most profound changes arrive without announcement, settling in slowly, until one day they feel permanent, and everyone realizes the transition happened quietly, while the world was still busy explaining why nothing had really changed.